Yeah. Okay, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Mitchell, and I'd like to welcome you to the ODI. I'm the director of ALNAP, and we're here today to launch the ALNAP study on effective leadership in humanitarian organisations. And when I say welcome, I do include any online visitors that we have. I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me. I do urge you to stay logged on if you can, because you will have an opportunity to input into the discussions later on. So, leadership. Why all the recent fuss about leadership? Well, what is it and why is it important? Well, we know from the surveys that we conducted a couple of years ago in the ALNAP State of the System report that most people believe that good leadership is the single biggest impediment to improved humanitarian performance. And that's not just at the level of resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in the UN system. That's right across the board in all operational agencies. But what is it that we actually mean when we talk about good leadership? What does it actually look like in practice? What are the actual determinants of good leadership? And I know that when we sat down a couple of years ago to design this study, we knew from different studies that had been conducted in the private sector and the public sector that there were various competencies that had been associated with good leaders in the military, in the private sector and the public sector. But we weren't sure whether those competencies actually matched up what actually makes a good humanitarian leader in the field. And so one of the questions that we set out to answer in this report is good humanitarian leadership essentially the same thing as good leadership in other sectors? And we knew that if we could get to the bottom of this question, we would have something very valuable, I think, to share with organisations that should be providing the kind of leaders that we need today. And we all knew that good leaders do exist. Indeed, I can look around this room now and I can see 2 or 3 myself. But we suspected, I think, at the beginning of this study that good operational leaders were out there, not as a result of the prevailing organisational culture, but in spite of it. And that was something else that we wanted to test. So there's quite a few questions here that we set out to answer. And to help us answer them today, we have an outstanding panel made up of established leaders in their own right, and indeed people whose job it is to foster or create the kind of institutional or organisational culture that grows good leaders. So let me introduce you to our panel. We have on our far left El Kadir Daloum. El Kadir was programme manager for Save the Children in Somalia for 2 years from July 2001. And in 2003 he was appointed country director for Somalia, a position that he held until 2007. And during this period he was the NGO consortium focal point, member of the steering group of the Somalia Aid Coordination Body and co-chair of the Educational Sectoral Committee. He was also a member of the Food Security Sectoral Committee, and he was on the steering group of the Food Security Assessment Unit. He continued to be an active member of the Somalia NGO Consortium. And El Kadir's leadership in Somalia, and particularly in relation to the Somalia NGO Consortium, is one of the 11 case studies that is in the report that we're launching today. Claire Messina is the Senior Coordinator of the Humanitarian Leadership Strengthening Unit in OCHA, and she's worked on migration and refugee issues in the former Soviet republics and the Baltic states with the IOM and UNHCR, and in various capacities with OCHA since 1998. And she holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University and a PhD from the Institute of Political Studies in Paris. And finally, sitting next to me is Major General Tim Cross. And Tim was commissioned into the British Army in 1971, and he's commanded at every level, from leading a small bomb disposal team in Northern Ireland in the 1970s to commanding a division of 30,000 in 2007 to 2004. He's completed a tour with the UN in Cyprus in 1980 to 81, and after operational deployment in Kuwait, Iraq in 1990 to 91, he served as a colonel in Bosnia between 1995 and 1997. In 1999, he was deployed to Macedonia, Albania and Kosovo and was appointed CBE in the subsequent operational awards for his work in leading the NATO response to the humanitarian crisis. In 2002, he became involved in the planning for operations in Iraq. He subsequently deployed to Washington, Kuwait and Baghdad as a deputy in the UN-led Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Affairs, later retitled as CPA.
US-led, not UN-led.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
But
The US.
it wasn't UN-led, really.
Yeah, it's a Freudian slip. He returned to the UK in 2003, took over a key staff appointment before assuming command of one of the 3 divisions of the UK Field Army from October 2004, retiring in January 2007. He's now director of 2 international aid agencies, a visiting professor at 3 universities, a defence advisor to the UK House of Commons Defence Committee and a number of UK international companies, and a trustee of a number of charities. How he's found the time to join us here today, I really don't know, but I think we're all delighted and honoured that he has. And of course that leaves us with the research study team leader, and I'm delighted to welcome Margie Buchanan-Smith. I'll just say a few words about Margie. She currently works as an independent researcher, consultant, trainer, facilitator and coach in the international humanitarian aid sector, and she is a senior research associate with ODI and a visiting research fellow with the Feinstein International Centre at Tufts University. And of course, Margie used to be coordinator here at HPG for some years, and so you're back in your old policy stomping ground, Margie. So, I think we are going to have next, Margie will present the findings of the study for about 25 minutes. Then we will have a reaction from each of the panelists, and then we should have about at least 50 minutes, 55 minutes for a discussion with all of us. So Margie, over to you.
Thank you.
What did your research study find out?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, John. And the first thing I want to say is this, I'm guessing this is working, I'll be told if it's not. The first thing I wanted to say was actually what a privilege it was to do this study, because this is looking at a very human, personal dimension of humanitarian response, humanitarian performance. And it gave us, Kim Scriven was also involved in carrying out the case studies, and it gave us an opportunity to ask really some very personal questions about how people did things, why they did things, what their values were. And I have to say it was both inspiring in terms of some of the stories we were being told, but also concerning. And I think hopefully you'll see why I kind of draw attention to both of those as I go through the findings. Oops. Okay, there we go. So first of all, let me talk a little bit about the leadership void in humanitarian action that John alluded to. So I was certainly hearing this, I think as many as like 10 years ago, people were talking about the problem of a lack of leadership, as if it had been there in the past and somehow it was missing. And I must say that was the time when I became interested in this subject. It's like, what do people mean by leadership? What is it that's missing? And I think this was confirmed in the ALNAP State of the System report, where it came out as one of the main challenges to humanitarian action, the lack of leadership, lack of effective leadership. It's been raised in evaluations, and somehow, despite this growing investment in leadership development programs, I think there's still a question mark about what do we mean by leadership, and what is it that people value, and what is it that they feel is lacking. So that's what we were attempting to look at in this study, is to identify what's valued in examples of effective operational humanitarian leadership. What is it that people value? And what is it that appears to determine or get in the way of effective leadership? We wanted to look at how the qualities of leadership varied between different types of humanitarian crises, and ultimately to identify, so what can the sector do and what can organisations do to really foster operational leadership in the future? If it seems to be this deficit of leadership, what can we do to improve that? So, what do we mean by leadership, or at least in this study? It's a hugely, it's very difficult concept to define. So what do we actually mean? Well, we kind of geographically bounded it for the purposes of this study to talk about operational leadership. And by operational leadership, we really mean leadership in country, so where the humanitarian crisis has happened, where the response is being launched. And this is the definition, our sort of working definition. It's not perfect, but we felt that this gave us a sort of clear direction. And I've just highlighted in red the bits I wanted to pull out. So first of all, the context in which we're talking about, in country, and if you go right to the end of the definition, we're talking about leadership often in challenging and hostile environments. There's a strategic element to that in that we're talking about clear vision, establishing a clear vision and objectives. There's a values dimension because we're talking about a focus on the affected population. And then I think there's some skills and behavioural stuff that's in there when we're talking about building a consensus that brings aid workers together around the vision and objectives, and also collectively realising the vision. And I really emphasise that word collectively. That's what leadership is about. It's actually about bringing people with you. It's not about doing it yourself. So, how did we go about studying it? And it was kind of both fun and challenging trying to find a way into this topic. And what we decided to do in the end was to really model excellence. So we felt that we could probably learn most by looking at case studies of widely accepted examples of effective leadership. And I think in this sector, we're very good at always looking at the constraints and what doesn't work, but we actually felt on this topic we could learn more from what does work. So we came up with 11 case studies. This was after quite wide canvassing of views, consultation. We came up with 11 case studies of effective leadership, 2 of whom are in this room, and at the risk of embarrassing, well, you now know Al-Qida Daloum was one of our examples of effective leadership, and at the risk of embarrassing Zara Pantuliano was the second one, who's sitting here, for the leadership that she played in relation to the NMPACT program in Sudan, the Nuba Mountains program in Sudan in the early 2000s. Most of our case studies did focus on the response phase to an emergency rather than preparedness or recovery. We very consciously looked at leadership in relation to different types of humanitarian crises: slow onset, rapid onset, conflict, natural disasters, and at 3 levels. So leadership at the highest level, if you like, in country, in terms of leadership to the overall international humanitarian response. We also had some examples of collective leadership where a number of individuals consciously came together and worked together to provide leadership. And we looked at leadership within an agency to its overall response or to an overall program. And our other way to try and make this huge topic manageable was after we did a scoping study which threw up 11 hypotheses that we felt sort of were seemed to be kind of more or less hitting the nail in terms of what we were hearing about leadership. And then we set out to test those hypotheses through the case studies. So that was our way in. What did we find? So this is really an outline of what I'm going to try and cover now. First of all, how leadership has to be earned. I think, perhaps not surprisingly, but very strikingly, it's not just about the position that people hold. It's actually about what they bring to that position. So as one of the leaders that we followed said, the authority you really have is the authority to exercise your ability to convince. It's not just about having a fancy job title. It's actually what do you bring to that position. And at least one of our examples of leadership was somebody who didn't have a high senior level position. So personal authority was really the determining factor. We explored what seemed to come across as the common qualities that were really valued in operational leadership, and I'll go into those in a minute. The significance of political skills came through very strongly, and I'll talk about that. Weaknesses, I'll also talk about that. What's the kind of flip side to what worked? What's different about humanitarian leadership? And then systemically, and I think this is absolutely key, and I'm hoping this is an area we might be able to focus on in the discussion, what fosters leadership and what obstructs it in our sector and in our organisations today. We also looked at how leadership is learned, which I won't touch on in this presentation just because of lack of time, but we can pick it up afterwards, and I'll talk a little bit about the value of collective leadership. So, the qualities of leadership. First of all, strategic leadership skills. So this is the first of the 5 categories. So this came through in terms of leadership skills that somehow relate to the bigger picture. And there's 3 ways of looking at this. First of all, what came through really strongly is the importance of understanding the wider context. And this is about individuals, leadership teams, who really invest in that kind of contextual analysis. Secondly, there's building a clear strategic vision of what the humanitarian operation is attempting to achieve, and absolutely critical is building ownership of that vision. So that again relates to this collective dimension. And then thirdly, the values bit, focusing on the affected population. And so this was a quote from one of the leaders that we were modelling, who said, "I put myself into the shoes of the affected population. I try to see it from the lens of the survivor. What kind of assistance do they want? And thinking ahead, so it's not just bags of rice, but is it really working from their perspective of what's needed?" And what was interesting was how that was fed back by staff working for some of our case study leaders. So things that came back was, this person really cared. And here's another quote. "She spoke with knowledge, passion, and commitment, and that commitment drew others who were committed." So there's something really critical, I think, around this. The second area is relational and communication qualities. And this was the finding we set out to test, the preliminary finding. Despite a tendency to focus on the results achieved by operational humanitarian leaders, it's often their relational and communication abilities that distinguish truly effective from strong leaders. Now, there's lots of ways we can unpack that, but let me just give you a few headlines. So first of all, the ability to listen and learn from others. And even the most experienced leaders recognized they didn't have all the answers and they had to listen. The ability to speak out, to have courageous conversations. So what do we mean by that? It means naming the things that aren't being named. It's raising the issues that are being ignored, but not just in a provocative, kind of denouncing kind of way. It's actually to facilitate meaningful exchange so that something is done about it. And then connecting with staff. So here's another quote from one of our interviewees. "If staff feel you care for them, they're willing to work for you." And as somebody else said, we were prepared to go the extra mile. The third area of qualities of leadership is decision-making and risk-taking skills. And I think here the critical balance is balancing the ability to make decisions rapidly in many humanitarian crises with the need to build consensus. And it's knowing where to draw the line in terms of a consultation process and when a decision needs to be made. one of the features of the situations that we're looking at is often you have incomplete, unreliable, contradictory information. So it's kind of working with what is good enough. Perfectionists are not going to survive, thrive in this kind of environment. There's something about a willingness to be held accountable for decisions taken, not only for yourself, but also your staff. And then something we're going to talk about quite a lot is risk-taking. It's something about a mature and balanced approach to risk-taking and quickly learning from mistakes. So here's another quote about a staff member referring to the leader they'd worked with. She was never afraid to take the next hurdle, to stumble where others might be more cautious. And the next one I like, but apologies to any civil servants in the room. If you don't take risks, it's all routine. You're a typical civil servant. Try things and make mistakes. But I think the key thing here is, how do you learn from the mistakes? Very quickly, I'm just going to go through another couple of other categories of qualities of leadership. Putting together a strong team. That emerged very strongly in our case studies, was the leadership environment that the leaders put in place around them. So if you haven't got something, you have to build a team. No one person can be a humanitarian leader. And I think there's a common refrain that you can't be a good manager and a good leader. But actually, interestingly enough, I think we can challenge that a little bit. And at least half of our case studies, the leaders were valued for being good managers, having an eye for detail, excuse me, as well as doing the strategic stuff. Personal qualities, a lot of these relate to values, principles, integrity, self-awareness, absolutely key, humility. And this is another quote I liked that came from one of the leaders that we interviewed. You need to lose your ego a bit. It's not about you. You have to put yourself in other people's shoes with respect and build trust. Tenacity and determination, and energy and enthusiasm. Let me say something about the importance of political skills. And I think these have long been relevant, but I think they're being articulated and recognized in a slightly different way these days. And why they're so important? Well, they can be key to negotiating and opening up humanitarian access, whether it's a conflict-related disaster or a natural disaster. So what do we mean by this? Well, we mean understanding the crisis through a political lens. We mean carrying out a political stakeholder analysis, not in some kind of procedural, lengthy way, but intuitively, rapidly, constantly updating that. And on the basis of that analysis, working out who is important to build relationships with. Relational networking skills, diplomatic, negotiating and facilitating skills all came through as being very important. And I think this quote is important. It's not about being a politician, but about being a humanitarian professional with political acumen. And I think, again, we are often in danger of undervaluing and not emphasizing this enough. So, in summary, what have we got? Well, I think we've got an unusually broad range of qualities and traits, but actually that is very much in line with findings from a study that was done in the UK of leaders in the voluntary sector, which came to the conclusion that actually the range of skills needed are often broader than are needed in other sectors, and I think this is very true in the humanitarian sector. Relational leadership is absolutely key, whether it's political skills we're talking about or how people relate to their staff. And then leadership is an art based as much on judgment and intuition as on predefined skills. And experience is absolutely key to developing and applying that judgment. And I think that's the warning to relying too much on competency frameworks, which try to somehow capture everything in a list of behavioral skills. There's something about the magic that turns good into great, which I think is often about people bringing all of themselves, and it's about judgment and it's about intuition. So, what do we need to watch out for when strengths become weaknesses? I mentioned energy and enthusiasm as being key qualities of the leaders that we were studying. And what was really striking was the very long hours that all of our case study leaders were working. So there was that tremendous commitment, but actually showed up in basically working with some. I think one of the words that was used was kind of boundless energy, but sometimes their teams or their staff members may not be able to match that pace. And the personal cost of humanitarian leadership was something that we became aware of in terms of the lack of work-life balance, in terms of the risk of burnout. We didn't come across burnout in any of our case studies, but I think you realize that it could be quite closely behind some of the examples of very effective leadership. And I think there's a real question here about how is it possible to be a really effective operational leader and to manage some kind of work-life balance and to provide a healthy role model to staff? We don't have the answer, but I think it's a really important question for all of us. So what's different about humanitarian leadership? Many of the skills that I think we've come up with are skills that would be recognizable in other sectors, but there's something about the edge to operational humanitarian leadership. It's something about the context in which leaders are operating. It's working with people in distress. It's often dangerous environments, and if you're leading by example, that's got very real implications. It's having to make life and death decisions about staff, about people who are affected by a crisis. And I think the fact that it's values-based is absolutely critical as well. So these are some of the ways in which it may not be totally different from other sectors, but it's somehow, there's a certain edge to it. We really tried to look hard at could you somehow come up with a typology of different kinds of leadership that are appropriate to different crises? And we really struggled to find broad distinctions. So it was very clear that the leadership style needs to be adapted to different contexts, but we couldn't come up with some neat typology that says in a rapid onset natural disaster, this is the kind of leadership style that you need. In a slow onset or maybe conflict-related crisis, this is what you need. That was too simplistic. But there's something about the significance of context, and the leaders who are best able to switch between crises are the ones who really pay respect and pay attention to the context and adapt their style, are able to adapt their style to that context, which is why I put that quote in at the bottom there. So, what fosters leadership? So this is now looking more systemically at the sector, and we came up with broadly three things. So the words that we heard quite frequently was something about having the space to lead. And that usually meant that it was the line manager of the individual concerned who provided that space to lead. And it doesn't mean a lack of critical engagement. I think it's not about sort of just sitting back and letting the person get on with it. It's something about constructively and critically engaging, but giving leaders space, giving managers space. Rewarding risk-taking. Now, one of the I think really important findings from this study is that most of the case study leaders we were studying took risks in spite of their organizations, not because of them. And I'm going to say a bit more about that. Structures can strengthen a leader's role. So, for example, in DRC, one of the leaders we were looking at was Ross Mountain as the HCRC and all the other UN roles that he was carrying as well. And the fact that you had a common humanitarian fund and a common humanitarian action plan certainly bolstered his authority, his leadership, but alone that wasn't enough. What obstructs leadership? I think that one of the big messages in this study is a really alarming tendency towards risk aversion in this sector. And I think it's related to a number of things, but the effect it's having is it's stifling the space for leadership to flourish and for creative leadership, for innovative leadership to flourish. So what is this about? Well, I think there have been very well-intentioned drive towards accountability and compliance, but I think it's left us with a very stifling culture of compliance. And I think this shows up in a number of ways. Very practically, the amount of literally form-filling, report writing, writing of log frames, etc., is taking senior managers a huge amount of their time. And secondly, there's something about this compliance which is just not giving people the space. There's too much box ticking, and there's not enough space for really creative, innovative leadership. Constraints of bureaucracy, I think, is pretty obvious. So I think there's a real concern that we've got incentive systems that reward managerialism rather than leadership. So here's a quote from one of our interviewees. "The incentive for people to make bold decisions and to step out of the mould is lacking. If you irritate a government or a major agency, and if you don't have a lot of experience, then you're putting your whole career on the line." And another quote from one of our leaders was, "This was first and foremost about a total disregard for my own career path." I mean, it's really, if you listen to those words, it's really salutary. I think we need to look at the selection and recruitment processes. To what extent are they being adapted to match the investment in leadership development? And then another area which I think is a really significant finding from this study are the obstacles to national staff becoming leaders. And I'm hoping this is something that Al-Qaeda will talk more about as an example of a nationally recruited staff member who has moved very effectively into an international leadership position. But the fact that this is quite rare, I think, is something that should be really concerning us all. Okay, I shall try and just see. Right, very briefly, this might be something we pick up in the discussion. Collective leadership, is it the way forward? So many of our case studies of individuals were successful because of the high-performing teams they built around them. So even though our model was to look at individual examples of leadership, it was the fact that they were really kind of releasing some collective potential that was key to their success. We looked at 3 case studies of collective leadership which were deliberately set up as collective leadership. The tripartite core group after Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, the IFRC FACT, Field Assessment Coordination Team in Haiti, and the NGO Joint Initiative in Zimbabwe. We can pick up some of the things that were key to those perhaps in the discussion, because I think I'm running out of time now. Okay? Okay. So what came out of that? The importance of establishing ground rules and operating procedures at the outset, absolutely key to making these work. What was interesting about each of them was there seemed to be a finite period when this cross-organisational leadership really worked. And there was something about, for it to be sustained, somehow it needed to be recreated and re-energised. But there's a lot more to look at that was beyond the scope of what we were able to do in this study. So, finally, what does this tell us about how we can foster operational humanitarian leadership in the future? And so here is, I'm really giving you shorthand for some of the recommendations that you'll find in the report. There's recommendations to the sector as a whole. I think there's a real challenge in this study to the risk-averse culture that's taken root. And that's a challenge to donors, who I think are requiring ever more rigorous and demanding reporting and planning procedures. And there are examples of organisations, I think they're few and far between, that have fostered a risk-taking culture. And in the report, we give you the example of the Kenya Red Cross Society. And what can we learn from those organisations that have successfully fostered a risk-taking culture? What can we learn and how can we replicate that? We would say the study really promotes the model of leader as host rather than the concept of the heroic leader. So we feel that that's the model that should be being picked up by leadership development programs. There's an urgent need to invest more in national leadership. And if we really take a hard look at ourselves, I think there's a lot of questions about the diversity of the sector. And having just come back from the World Humanitarian Studies Conference in Boston, where there was perhaps a dozen out of 450 representatives from the global south. Big challenge to us all. How can we foster... then there's also a set of recommendations for humanitarian aid organisations. And I think this is for senior managers, this is for chief executives. To what extent are senior managers really being given the space to lead? And I think this is really an invitation to organisations to reflect on their own cultures. What is the organisation's appetite for risk? And what can be learned from organisations that perhaps have got a greater appetite for risk? Do incentive systems reward and do recruitment processes seek out key leadership qualities? What we were hearing quite often is that technical skills are valued, but some of the relational and communication skills that are key to effective leadership are not being valued in the way that they need to be. And then finally, what does this say for leadership development programs? I think it really encourages organisations to see leadership development as part of career development, not just as a bolt-on for senior staff, but actually to think about it all the way up through the organisation. How do you start to foster leadership with junior staff, with people coming into the organisation, offering them reflective space? I've already mentioned being beware of the overly reductionist approaches to leadership, beware of the limitations of competency frameworks. And I really want to mention the value of role models and mentoring. This came through quite strongly from our case study leaders. How had they learned their leadership? It was role models, it was mentoring. Interestingly, very rarely was it from actually formal training programs and support through coaching. So that's where I want to leave it. I think it gives us a lot to chew on, and it gives us a lot to respond to. We would be the first to say that we haven't answered all the questions, and we're very much aware that there's issues around collective leadership. There's much more work to be done on risk-taking, and there's much more work to be done on I think, the gender issues, not only gender determinants of leadership, but also we struggle to find a number of examples of effective female leadership at the operational level. And I think we need to, again, ask ourselves, if we look at has any work been done looking at the gender balance of field-based managers? Is it pretty equal, or is it still a very male-dominated field? And so I think there's plenty of agendas and further work that needs to be done, but I think this gives us quite a lot to chew on. Thank you.
Margie, thank you. That was beautifully presented and really clear and very interesting. I think before we go to the panellists, I just wanted to pause for breath just for a minute here. And I wondered if anybody had any points about the method for this study. We're going to get to the substantive stuff just in a minute, but I wondered, just in case anyone had any questions about the hypotheses, the case studies, the interview process. If you don't, that's fine, but just in case we've got any methodological... we do, please. I wonder, before, let's just... Yeah. Yes, you have to speak into the microphone, obviously, because otherwise people can't hear you. And I wonder, could you say who you are and which organisation you come from? And if you don't mind standing up, if that's possible.
Sure.
Is that okay, so people can see who you are?
My name is Yumi, and I'm a postgraduate student at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Study at University of London. I study post-conflict development. And my question is that you gave a definition for coding for leadership, but and a lot of your conclusions revolved around risk-taking and the aversion of risk-taking, but you didn't give a very clear definition or a coding methodology for how do you define risk? Yeah.
Do we know how we define risk?
Good question. I'm afraid I think we were a bit organic and a bit intuitive in how we defined risk. So it's a good challenge to us, because I'm not sure that we did, if I'm really honest, I'm not sure that we did actually kind of define it very clearly. I think our kind of starting point was, because of the environments we're working in, the kinds of things we're trying to do, you can only do it if you're prepared to take risk, in the sense of doing things where you cannot, I mean, we can never guarantee that something's going to work, but I think that, what would you say, that margin of, is something going to work or is it not, is often very, very unclear in a lot of humanitarian work because of the environments we're working in. But unless you're prepared to take that, I'm trying to find another word beyond leap of faith, because I think it's balanced, mature, responsible risk-taking is not a leap of faith. It's not totally a leap of faith, but it's something about being prepared to try something out. Because, if you don't, you could stay safe, but actually you're never going to achieve your objective. So it's a good challenge to us. I don't think we did absolutely define risk, but I hope that gives a sort of sense of what we were looking at.
But then wouldn't that
Microphone.
But then wouldn't that be more of a confines of the organization in which the individual is working for? Because if the individual, being a leader in themselves, has the ability to take that risk, but they're confined by the rules of their organization, and especially when you're working in the field in humanitarian crises. So wouldn't it also be a factor of the rules and the regulations of that particular organization, and not just the individual, and rather they have the ability to take that leap of faith?
And I think if I understand you correctly, I think that's the nub of it, is that what we were finding was individuals, there was a lot of courageous decisions that individuals took. And I think this is where it was in spite of rather than because of their organizations. So the organizations, and often more senior managers, were not necessarily creating that space that encouraged leaders to do that in a way that would guarantee, but that where they were offering their backing. And I think what was valued with some of our effective examples of leadership was the fact that they would back the staff working for them. So they would encourage their staff to take risks, and they were prepared to back their staff if things didn't work out. They were not going to scapegoat that person. That was kind of one of the differences.
No, we're just straying into the substantive area now, so just if there's any other clear questions on the method at this particular point, please. Microphone, you say who you are.
Katie Hatfield from British Red Cross. Just wondered if you considered, I've had a quick look at the interviewee list, did you consider doing interviews as a control with people from either the public sector, donors, governments, or the private sector, just to, perhaps it was done and is not there, just how that was set up?
What we did, it would be a few interviews really literally around the fringes. Mainly it was a lack of resources and a lack of time issue. But what we did do is in fact there's one, I haven't touched on it at all in my presentation, but there's a chapter in the report where we actually did look at the wider literature on leadership, and in particular we looked at the findings of research on leadership in the private sector. There was one very useful study on leadership in the public sector in the UK, so and other studies on leadership in the UN. So we did draw on those. I didn't touch on them in the presentation, but no, we did try and relate our findings to those and use those as the kind of springboard.
Good.